Hello and welcome to the Daily Journal's Capitol View webcast, where we talk about state politics each week. I'm Chris Kiefer, managing editor for multimedia here at the Daily Journal. And as always, we are joined by Daily Journal Capitol Bureau Chief Bobby Harrison, who has the expertise from the state capitol. Bobby, what's going on down there today?
Oh, they just been taking up budget bills, killing cigarette tax proposals. Just another day in the life of the legislators.
Just another day. Bobby, one of the, I guess, bigger issues that's come up lately, I know there's been a few kind of main themes we've been tracking throughout this legislative session, one of them being transportation. And we've, of course, talked a lot on this program about the belief by most that the state needs more money for transportation, deteriorating system of roads and bridges. The problem is finding where that money is going to come from. So the issue had been kind of slow to develop for a while. The Senate finally passed a proposal a couple of weeks ago. The House, I guess, basically had a counter proposal last week. Walk us through the different proposals and where things stand today.
Well, both proposals, Chris, are, there's a aversion to raising taxes in this building for the most part. So neither proposal raises any new revenue from by increasing taxes. It does raise a little bit of revenue, by probably less than $1 million, by putting a fee on hybrid cars and electric cars that don't pay the same amount of gasoline tax that conventional cars pay. But except for that small tax increase, the other aspects of the legislation, they depend on bonding, issuing bonds, which is incurring long-term debt for the state, or by dipping into other sources of revenue that normally go to fund education, public health, or law enforcement, and those types of things. The key difference in the two bills is that the Senate essentially takes more of that money than the House does, but they both rely on different sources of revenue that go to other programs, and taking that money and sending that money to transportation instead. I guess from one aspect, the biggest difference in the two bills, Chris, is that the Senate proposal, touted by Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves, who presides over the Senate, really is while it is detrimental to the Department of Transportation. It is the Senate proposal establishes new committees and bureaucracy that would perform many of the same functions, or take functions away from the Department of Transportation and its 3 elected transportation commissioners. The House bill does not do that. I mean, that may be the biggest difference in the two pieces of legislation. The House, what money it takes, it sends it to the Department of Transportation, which of course is governed by that 3-member elected Transportation Commission.
Sure. So, I mean, this has obviously been a big issue that the Department of Transportation has advocated for. I know you had a couple stories coming out of the Neshoba County Fair. Central District Transportation Commissioner Dick Hall, am I getting the name right?
That's right.
He had made some strong pleas, I guess, at the Neshoba County Fair for more money for roads and bridges. Yet, I guess, despite their interest in this, as you wrote, there was a lot of concerns from the Department of Transportation about the Senate proposal specifically, correct?
Yeah, I mean, one aspect of the Senate proposal actually took, over a 5-year period of time, $125 million away from the Department of Transportation, which kind of sounds counterintuitive. But it took the money from the Department of Transportation to give it to another entity that would be controlled by the governor's office to build roads and bridges. So it was kind of a unusual circumstance. There's I guess a belief that the 3-member commission needs some additional oversight. The House bill doesn't do that, and Mississippi, and I hadn't really gotten into this, Chris, but Mississippi is maybe the only state, one of the few states, that has this type of setup where the Department of Transportation is actually governed by an elected body instead of being part of the governor's office or some other entity in state government. I mean, it's governed by an elected body, and there's been talk for years, going back to the 80s, that Mississippi should replace the elected commission with an appointed director of the Department of Transportation. But just a lot of people think that if you're going to do that, you should tackle that head on instead of just setting up another entity to be in as the Senate bill does, to be in conflict, if you will, with the current Department of Transportation.
What do you make, going back to, again, the Senate bill, kind of taking some power away from the Department of Transportation, giving it to the governor, that had to, I guess, had more authority in deciding how some of the funds would be spent, and taking money away from it? Is that seen as a political move? Is that retribution for speaking out about it at Neshoba County Fair? Is that the lieutenant governor kind of being one of the strong candidates for governor, and maybe kind of giving some extra power to the governor's mansion before he's in it? Or, I mean, kind of, what do you make of that?
It could be all of the above. I mean, the lieutenant, of course, the current governor, Phil Bryant, when he was asked about that, he didn't, he didn't say he was opposed to it. I mean, he was amenable to, he had problems with the other aspects of the Senate bill, such as taking, money that's currently goes into reserve funds and sending it to the Department of Transportation. He had problems with that, but he didn't have problems with, portion of the legislation that would give his office or his more, or his people under his office more power. He didn't have problems with that. And, of course, Lieutenant Governor Reeves, he has aspirations to be governor, but at least that's, the perception. There's some thought now that he may be going to Washington, D.C. I assume we'll be talking about that later on in this program. But, for years he's had aspirations to be governor. And, it was his bill. So, the conclusion of many is that he was trying to consolidate more power into office that he hopes to hold one day.
Another aspect of the House bill would take money from the use tax, from basically the tax on internet sales, and give that to the counties and cities. Is that right? And I guess that's kind of being an issue, is local governments also not having enough money for their road needs.
Right. That's a key aspect of their bill. And that, that money currently goes to, as I said earlier, education, not transportation, education, health, public health, law enforcement, all entities that a lot of people feel are being underfunded already by state government. And it would take about $100 million from those entities through in use tax revenue and transfer that money to the cities and counties. The argument is, from the cities and counties perspective, is right now the cities get 18.5% of all the sales tax collected within their borders. Sales tax is 7% tax on most retail items. Mm-hmm. Now, if it's internet sales or sales from out of state that is where the 7% tax is tacked onto, the cities don't get any of that. And so there's an argument that the cities are saying that the sales tax is slowly declining as more people buy, make purchases on the internet and stuff. So they want a slice of that money too. And so the House is trying to accommodate them by sending that money to them to be used on transportation, for transportation needs. But the flip side of the argument is it's taking another $100 million out of the general fund at the time when the general fund's already, has absorbed major cuts because of tax cuts. And because of those tax cuts, multiple agencies have had their funding cut. So, and this will just be another hit to those agencies if this goes through.
Sure. Both bills, as you've already said, rely on a lot on bond money to spend some of that money. I think the Senate bill, a lot of those projects, the bulk of those projects are in the Jackson metro area. The House, somewhat the same, but it had a few more projects throughout the state, including a few more in Northeast Mississippi. Is that right? Right.
There's some small projects in Northeast Mississippi. Some of them is kind of hard to explain. You got $500,000 for the city of Corinth just for transport, to help with transportation needs. I think the same for the city of Ripley. I think probably if you contacted any city, in Northeast Mississippi or any city throughout the state and said, hey, do you want an extra $500,000 to help out with, paving streets and fixing potholes and stuff, they'd say, yeah, we can use that money. But the House bill, directs that money to Corinth and to Corinth and to Ripley and some other cities throughout the state. But it leaves out a lot of cities at the same time. So I'm not sure what that's about, other than it just, they're trying to spread the money out so it doesn't all go to Jackson, but the Jackson metro area. So I assume that's what that's all about.
So what happens now, Bobby?
Well, the bill, it was originally a Senate bill, and it passed the Senate, it went to the House. The House put their amendments in it, changed it in ways we've talked about, and that goes back to the Senate. And the Senate has the option to accept the House changes and send it to the governor, or to invite conference, which is what they would do. And in that conference process, the key House and Senate members will meet to kind of negotiate a final product that most likely will be voted on during the final week, if they can reach an agreement. That it will be voted on the final week of the session, sometime before April 1st.
Is it? I guess it's hard to say now what is likely to happen. I guess once it goes to conference, anything can happen, huh?
Yeah, anything can happen. I'm just done a story right now. I just finished and filed, Chris, just kind of jumping ahead. That there was legislation alive that didn't increase the tax on cigarettes, but the legislation had language where somebody could amend it later on in the process to increase the tax on cigarettes. Now, that legislation died today, but the House Ways and Means Chairman Jeff Smith says he believes under the legislative rules that transportation bill that we've just been talking about for the past 5 minutes or so could be amended to increase the tax on cigarettes. Of course, that would be a source of new revenue for transportation if that was done. So, just who knows? There's, if you can increase the tax on cigarettes in that bill, maybe you could put a lottery in that bill too. I just don't, everything seems to be on the table at this point. So I'd be fraught to speculate on what the final bill would look like.
Sure. Well, that's a good segue to the next thing I wanted to ask you about. The lottery is an issue that looked like it was dead for this session. It was an issue that had gotten a lot of buzz going into the session. But again, it didn't look like anything was going to happen until it did last week. Alice Clark, who's been a longtime lottery proponent, added some language to an appropriations bill that could clear the way for a lottery. It might not. What happened with that?
Well, it would set up some steps. If this Clark language stays in the bill, which most people don't think it will, it would set up some steps that could lead to a lottery. What the language, she added language to the appropriations bill for the state gaming commission. The gaming commission oversees, regulates the casinos in the state and charitable bingo. And her language said that no money could be expended to operate that agency until the legislature enacts a lottery. So at this point in the process, just a pure lottery bill for it to be taken up would take a 2/3 votes of each chamber. So there's this bill, this Clark amendment, while it keeps the lottery alive, it's still it would take a lot of steps to get to a point where a lottery be enacted. Even with the Clark amendment. So while the issue stays alive, it's not. It still isn't likely to pass this session.
It seems like it's one of those interesting issues, Bobby, that it doesn't look likely to pass in the sense that the House seems to have an appetite for it. They voted for this amendment by a 88-26 margin. A couple of years ago, they passed a couple of bills on a lottery that went to the Senate. And meanwhile, over in the Senate, you've got this pledge from Senator Phil Moran of Kill that had signed commitments from 40 of the 52 senators saying they support a lottery. Yet, despite that, I guess neither of the leaders of those chambers, Tate Reeves or Philip Gunn, are in favor of it. And I guess that alone is enough to pour some cold water on the proposal.
Yeah, that's why you just keep on thinking, that there's still maybe something that happens at some point this session, or even in addition to what you talked about the majority of the House and Senate. Governor Phil Bryant has come out saying, who used to be a strong lottery opponent, has come out saying that, it at least should be discussed. And, he's kind of indicated that he'd be willing to do more than discuss it and sign a bill enacting a lottery. And so, but at this point, because of all that momentum, you just wonder still something's going to happen before the end of the session, before they, go home. Of course, probably at this point in the session, if there was all of a sudden a moment where everybody came together and said, we do want to pass a lottery, that at this point, probably the easiest way to do it would be to the governor to call a special session within the session. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying that's going to happen, but, there just seems to be a lot of people saying they support a lottery, yet nothing, the bills never go anywhere.
Sure. Speaking of that concept of calling a special session within a session, We've
Oh, we're
talked.
doing good, Chris. So going from one subject to the next.
We've got some good segues today. It's good. So it's like we got our rhythm going.
Yeah.
Um, we've talked. I don't remember, Bobby. It was last week, 2 weeks ago. Of course, the fact that this education funding proposal that the House and the Senate leaders have wanted, that Philip Gunn and Tate Reeves have worked on to change the MAEP into a new formula. It died for the current session a couple weeks ago when the Senate sent it back to committee, and that essentially killed the legislation. Despite that, there had been some buzz. You wrote about it this week that some people talking about maybe it's not completely dead for the year. Maybe there's a chance of a special session within a regular session. And where does all that stand right now?
Yeah, that seems to be the consensus at this point. That'd be the only way to pass the bill, which would change the current funding formula. Of course, the Mississippi Adequate Education Program. At this point, the only way to change that, it appears to be for the governor to call a special session. And the proponents of the MAEP formula have been pretty vocal in saying they believe that's a possibility. That it was a surprise to many when the Senate killed the rewrite. I guess was it last week, a week before last. That was a surprise to many, and there's been talk since it was killed that the leadership would make an effort to convince members to change their minds and then call a special session where the governor would call a special session where they would take up a new funding formula. The governor, when I asked him about it last week, he said there was no plans to call a special session, but that could, he didn't rule out the possibility of that changing in the future. So I think the bottom line, Chris, is if the leadership thought they had the votes, that there'd be a special session, but I find it hard to believe that there was 29. What was it? It was there was 8 Republicans
right.
vote with the 19 members of the Democrat caucus in the Senate to kill that bill. I just find it hard to believe at this point those 8 members, enough of those 8 members would change their mind to vote to rewrite the MAEP unless there were significant changes made to that rewrite proposal. And as we talked about before, the problem with making significant changes to the rewrite proposal is one of the primary goals of the rewrite proposal. I mean, there's, one of the goals they say is that the MAEP formula is outdated and they don't like the way it sends money to the school districts. But the bottom line is that it was clear that MAEP sent more money to local school districts than the rewrite did. And so one of the things that that came out is the proponents of the rewrite wanted a formula that would send less money to the local school districts. And it's a tough thing to ask members to vote for a proposal that sends less money to your local school district. So that's the issue they're up against. And so they came close to passing that rewrite, but I mean, I just don't. I mean, it would be a surprise to me at this point if anything happened this year or even next year.
Sure. And you mentioned that they have to switch, the 8 Republican votes or several of them. And you quoted at least one of them in your story, Nikki Browning from Pontotoc, who said he wasn't planning on changing his vote. And, he would.
Yeah, he was pretty firm.
Yeah.
That he was firm from, pretty much onset that, he didn't want to make a change that, could be detrimental to his school districts.
Sure. One more issue from the legislature I want to talk about, we talked about it before, is I guess guns in schools is the term they use with it, but basically the bill that would, and it's changed in several different forms. The way it is right now, it would allow school districts to arm teachers that had certain training. I think we might have talked about it last week. I think after it come out of committee in the Senate. It went before the full Senate last week, and what the proposal would do right now basically is it would mandate certain training that teachers would have to be able to have guns in schools. Is that right?
Yeah, I believe it's 36 hours, a minimum of 36 hours of training administered by the Department of Public Safety. And then you would also have yearly updates on your training, I believe, under the proposal. And Briggs Hobson, the Senate Judiciary Aid Chairman, pointed out, he argued that under current law, before this bill, that if you have an enhanced carry permit, which I think provides, that requires essentially a day's worth of training, that technically a school teacher or a school employee could already carry a gun in school if the school district said it was okay. So he said what this bill is actually doing is requiring more training for school districts to say it's okay for school teachers or others staff members to carry guns in school. I mean, the flip side of this is that it kind of is, opening a door broader for school districts that might want to consider this. Some people think it'd be a good thing for in today's environment to have armed people in the schools. Other people say it shouldn't be the duty of a teacher to have a gun in school, that so many bad things could happen. But the bottom line is this bill passed the Senate and it's going back to the House, and I think there's probably a good chance it's going to go to the governor before the end of the session.
You mentioned some of the, I guess, opponents of the bill. As you noted in your story, we had a letter to the editor last week that was signed by more than 300 university and community college staff. That I thought you had a quote from it. A classroom with guns ceases to be an environment where teachers or students can feel safe engaging in the sorts of stimulating and challenging discussions that are the hallmarks of higher education. This is not an education that will prepare our young adults to boldly take their places in the world. So that kind of speaks to, I guess, the sentiment that's against the bill. Another thing, Bobby, I thought was interesting was kind of the votes against the bill were kind of in two separate camps. You had one camp that was opposed to guns in school and saw the bill as too permissive. And then you had another camp that saw the bill as too restrictive because it requires more training than is already required for teachers, correct?
Right. And also another, this bill, this was what happened in the Senate last week, but this was really originally a House bill. And, it came out of the House before the school shooting happened down in Parkland, or is that the name of the
yeah, that's correct, in Florida, right?
So when it came out of the House, that school shooting hadn't occurred. And what the original intent of the bill was to give people who have an enhanced carry permit the authority to essentially file a lawsuit if, say, a university or a community college or a high school prohibited those people from carrying a gun, say, at a football game or a basketball game. And that's where it came out of the House. And the Southeastern Conference had voiced concern with that legislation. The university president had voiced concern, and so it was changed in the Senate to incorporate this guns in school language, but at the same time ban guns from being carried to athletic events as long as there was a armed guard, as long as there was armed security at the athletic event. So a lot of people didn't like that change. They want people to be able to carry guns to the football games and stuff.
So even though that the Senate bill completely really changes the original House's intent of the bill, do you still think it'll go through the House?
Yeah, I think it's gonna. I mean, I think there's a good chance to go to conference, but I would be surprised at the end if didn't something come out that I would. I mean, and I'm just sort of stepping out on a limb here, but I would venture a guess that after all the ruckus from the Southeastern Conference and stuff, that the final version is going to be close to the Senate version, to the Senate bill that requires you extra training, but allows people to carry, allow school districts at their discretion. It's not mandatory. Allow school districts at their discretion to place armed faculty or teachers or other employees in the school districts or universities or community colleges. But I think there'll be some type of ban on the guns and athletic events, even if you have an enhanced carry permit. And that's just, like I said, that's just an educated guess on my part. It's probably completely wrong, but I would venture that's what the final bill is going to look like.
Sure. It'd be interesting to follow. Bobby, we talked a little bit earlier in the show. I guess it's still holding on to see what happens with the Senate seat. Thad Cochran, we've talked about before, announced that he'll retire at the end of April, beginning of April, at the end of this month, and that leaves Governor Phil Bryant to make an appointment to fill out that seat, and then of course there'll be the drama of who runs for it and what happens there. But where are we in the governor making an appointment, and what is some of the latest buzz on that?
Have we talked about this on this program since when did Senator Cochran announce his retirement? I can't remember.
It was early last week, and to be honest, I know because I get it mixed up. We did the memo podcast on it and talked to you on that. It might have actually been since we've recorded Capitol View.
Yeah, I mean, before we talk, I mean, just let me say, I mean, Senator Cochran is an icon in the state. I mean, he was elected to the U.S. He's a Pontotoc native, but he was first elected to the U.S. House in 1972 from a sort of a Jackson-centric Southwest Mississippi district. Was elected to the Senate in '78. Was the first Republican elected statewide since Reconstruction, and just built inroads with so many communities in the state, and was just it was an icon in so many ways. He's stepping down and I think we talked about this before. In my lifetime, there's only been, the U.S. senators were John Stennis and Eastland, and Senator Eastland, and then Trent Lott and Thad Cochran, and now Roger Wicker and Thad Cochran, and now we're going to have so it's, when we get a new senator in Mississippi, it's a big deal, and we're gonna have an election on Senator Wicker's post this year. That's regularly scheduled election. And as well, we're going to have that special election to fill the Cochran seat. So there's a lot of moving parts in this. Senator Cochran announced he was going to step down on April 1st. So within roughly 10 days of April 1st, maybe a few more days past April 1st, Governor Bryant, by law, will be required to name a replacement who will serve until the special election, which will be on the same day as the regular November elections. I think that's November 6th, I believe.
That sounds right.
Right around there. So right now, you already have people qualified to run in the Wicker seat. Of course, Senator Wicker from Tupelo running for re-election. You have Chris McDaniel challenging him in the Republican primary. Chris McDaniel almost beat Senator Cochran in 2014. And then you have several Democrats running that election, and that when Governor Bryant makes that appointment, there's some speculation that Chris McDaniel will drop out of the race against Senator Wicker and run for in that special election, against whomever Governor Bryant appoints. And then Mike Espy, a former, he was the first African American elected to the U.S. House for Mississippi since Reconstruction. He was elected in the early 90s or late 80s, I guess. And he's already announced he's going to run in that special election. So there's just who knows what's going to happen. He's going to be interesting rest of the year in politics in Mississippi.
Sure, it'll be very interesting. Bobby, I guess the names, it seems like we may have talked about these before, that you hear the most as far as the possible appointment are Tate Reeves, Philip Gunn, Delbert Hosemann. Is that still the latest on kind of what you hear?
Yeah, but it's interesting because Lieutenant Governor Reeves, there's been talk that he wants to, as we talked about earlier, he wants to run for governor, and he would not be interested in that Senate seat. But people point out that until it's actually offered to you, when a U.S. Senate seat is offered to you, it's hard to turn down. Yeah. So we'll see what happens there. Philip Gunn is the House Speaker, but he's never run a statewide, campaign before, so he doesn't have as much name ID. People like me know all about him, who cover and pay attention to state politics, but a lot of the average people would know who the House Speaker, Mississippi House Speaker was or is. And then and Delbert Hosemann has a lot of state, having been elected to Secretary of State 3 times, has a lot of statewide name ID. But, Governor Bryant says he wants to appoint someone who can be there 20, 25 years. And Delbert, Secretary of State Hosemann, is probably outlive us all, but he's very healthy, appears to be anyway, but he's 70 years old. So, he may be a little older than what Governor Bryant is looking for. And, and you also hear Ag Commissioner, Commissioner of Agriculture, that's a statewide elected post. Cindy Hyde-Smith, her name has popped up several times as a possible candidate. So but we'll just have to see. But, why this is such an important appointment for Governor Bryant, it's just, part of his legacy. And then but he also don't want part of his legacy being appointing someone who loses in the special election. The way the special election is set up is, you run in November, and with no party affiliation, it would just be the names on the ballot. Won't say Republican and Democrat, everybody be on the ballot together, and the top two, and you have to win a majority of the vote, or the top two vote getters advance to a runoff election. And you got to think that Mike Espy is going to get a considerable amount of the Democratic vote, and has a good chance of advancing to that runoff. And so, you want Governor Bryant wants that Republican advances to the runoff to be his appointee. So there's a good bit of pressure on him in making this appointment.
Sure. I'll make a quick plug. You talked a little bit about Senator Cochran and his legacy also as part of that. We did an extensive podcast. Bobby, you were part of that. Talked on it on the Memos podcast, the Daily Journal's podcast, where we take a single topic and go in depth each week. And so the most recent episode that came out last Thursday was about Senator Cochran, looking back at his legacy. So anyone who's interested in hearing more of that, you can find it. Look for the Memo podcast in Google Play and Apple Podcasts. Go to memo.tjournal.com and you can check that out. Bobby, before we close this week, kind of what's on tap? What are you kind of watching in the legislature? What are the biggest things going on right now?
It's getting to kind of the end of the session, Chris. The next couple of weeks, they're gonna have to pass a budget. It's really down to the last about 3 weeks, and so what happens the rest of the session? This is kind of where it kind of, the session from a reporter standpoint gets harder to cover. Most of it, a lot of it happens behind closed doors, and you have to be kind of chasing people around instead of just, committees meeting and it happening all right there in front of you. Now it gets to the point where you have to kind of chase people down and kind of find out where bills are, because a lot of it happens in conference committees. Mm-hmm. And technically conference committees are supposed to be open to the public, but they have ways of getting around that mandate. And so a lot of times it just is a matter of having to catch the right person at the right time. But the budget and those, the revenue bills concerning, the real drama, I think, of the next 2 weeks are going to be the revenue bills regarding, the bonds and how they're going to fund transportation. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. As far as general bills, there's, we talked about the gun bill. There's really not a lot of general bills out there that's going to be controversial or cause a lot of consternation. But it's going to be that the budget is kind of locked in, I think, mainly because the state doesn't have any money. There's a chance that they might have a little bit more money than they anticipated. Revenues, as I wrote about this weekend, revenues are growing at a steady pace, not at a fast pace, but at a steady pace. So they may have a little bit more money than they had past couple of years. But the real drama is going to be around those revenue bills and trying to fund transportation and bonds for universities and colleges and those types of things.
Sure. Well, you can follow all Bobby's coverage of that in your Daily Journal or at tjournal.com. That does it for another episode of Capitol View. Remind you, you can catch us each week at tjournal.com. Our normal time is Monday at 2. Sometimes, as in this week, we had to change it around, and just look for updates at the Daily Journal's Twitter. You can follow that at tjournal now, and kind of as we have a time, we'll put it out there. So we thanks for joining us. We thank you for watching, and as always,